We're very pleased to have with us tonight as our keynote speaker, Esmonde Crawley, the editor of Over 50's Housing Weekly News. Mr. Crawley.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Given the topic tonight, I'm going to speak to you all as a consumer. I'm going to talk to you tonight, 61 years of age. I'm not quite, but I'm trailing the first speaker by 20 years, but I'm still in the broad category. And what I'm going to talk to you about is I'm not going to take the position of any healthcare provider, long-term care provider or nursing home care provider. And I'm going to invite you to consider what I'm about to say tonight before you make any decisions in Sudbury about the goods and services that you're going to require, and that you consider these from a consumer's point of view first. And once you've got a grip on just what the consumer wants, then frame the goods and services for that outcome. But before I go into what the consumer really wants, I'm going to talk about the fact that there are two generations at play here. The first generation I'm going to refer to as the veterans, and they in theory are post-65. And then I'm going to talk about the boomers who run from 45 to 64. The difficulty that we're going to face in Sudbury is that the aspirations of these two groups are not necessarily the same. Veterans, by definition, went through a depression. They're going through a second one. And it's not a medical one, it's a financial one. They went through at least one world war. They believe in their value system that the government owes them a living. They've paid their taxes, they've been loyal, and now is the time in their life when there is an expectation that they will have in their final years comfort, consideration, and the warmth of a community. They, by any stretch of the imagination, are loyal people. They are parsimonious, tight, frugal. My mother was a representative of them, and what she did was she would rather spend all winter under a blanket to save $10 on the fuel bill so that each of the 4 children could inherit an additional $2.50. You will never get honesty from this group, because what they will do is tell you what they believe you want to hear. You can't focus group them. You can't inquire on any basis. And they are so uncomplaining that you all believe you've done a fantastic job in looking after them. They can be shoehorned into any situation and they'll smile back at you generally. They are a loving group, and they've misled us into thinking that we are better than we really are. So you're going to have a shock when the next generation marches into your hospital beds, into your LTCs and nursing homes, palliative care and hospices, and they're the boomers, born of a different ilk. Selfish, utterly self-absorbed, brought up by mothers who read Dr. Spock, mothers who stayed at home 24/7 to nurture these little geniuses and told them that they were all wonderful. They were going to change the world. And to a large degree they have. They have been highly influential in music, the arts, and a whole raft of developed sciences. but they also brought with them the disease of divorce. They are not retiring. They may very well at the age of 60 or 65 decide to take a different course in life. They don't believe in their vulnerabilities. They don't recognise healthcare signs. They don't respond to anything with the word age. They disavow a grab bar, and they drive down the highways of the world looking at over 50s housing and thinking it applies to someone else. They all still believe they are genuinely 31. A woman will go past a shopping centre mall shop front window and look at it to adjust her hair, lipstick and skirt. A man never looks anywhere for fear of what he might see. What he has locked into his brain is the absolute determination that he will never age. So therefore the essence of badging, of planning, any word, any pejorative word that mentions any of these images is simply not acknowledged. And so, my observations over the last 5 years in particular suggest that we as an industry, and I'm talking here broadly as healthcare providers in some shape or form. Now, in Canada, we have hundreds of terms. For the purposes of tonight, all of us live either independently, semi-dependently, or dependently. And I'm going to suggest to you that we have been so poor in providing for our constituency, we have been so hogtied by our belief that we are regulated to death, we've so negatively approached the outcomes simply because we didn't believe that they were possible, and yet all around us there are hundreds of interlopers and outside commercial organisations that are targeting the over 70 successfully, and we don't even acknowledge that they are in our industry. Can anyone here tell me who's the best assisted living provider in the world that's grown 29% compound for the last 4 years? That organisation's not registered particularly under any of the regulations in Canada, but it's the cruise industry. And the cruise industry's been so successful in targeting the 75-year-old Canadian that what has happened in effect is they have recognised what we've failed to. And the simple reason for their success is that every night across the dance floor comes a slightly younger man who looks you in the eye and asks you for the pleasure of the next dance. You feel 31 again. Nothing on the cruise boat reminds you of age. There are no grab bars. Nothing resonates and reminds you of your fallibility. You know at the back of your mind that there is an operating theatre, a team of doctors, nurses who call gently in your master bedroom of an evening just to check on you. Cruise companies have targeted this audience because they have discovered by purpose building boats and putting women in tiny spaces that we wouldn't even consider on land and charging them less than $250 per week for full board and meals, and placing them 26 stories below deck in spaces they can't sell to anyone else. They have turned our seniors into cost covering in every boat that's coming out of the Northern Hemisphere in the last 4 seasons. Seniors respond to it because they're going and mixing with a series of generations. The outside wings of the boat are occupied by couples on relationship renewal, and the cruise company is covering all of its costs in the bowels of the boat by targeting seniors. 10 years ago, 0.1% of seniors lived on boats perennially. The figure last year hit 9%. They change boats and lines in hemispheres and seasons and countries, but they are becoming the most viable assisted living provider in the world. I'm going to refer to a couple of operators that I now refer to as the raison d'etre housing, and the difference between the generations when you're considering housing structures is that people will not retire. They will find other methods of occupying their times. They may end up as volunteers. I recently attended the graduation ceremony in Christchurch in New Zealand of a 94-year-old surgeon who had been retired because he had the shakes. And it was no longer insurable. But what he was doing was rewriting the books of anatomy, for he felt that medical schools no longer had the basic skill sets in their libraries, and he felt it was in need of a revision. In Melbourne, Australia, it's possible for me, should my wife die, and even though I have 4 children, to now join the Catholic priesthood and be given a parish anywhere in Melbourne. I still have to take all 3 vows. But what we're seeing worldwide is that there is a desire to change the way that we live. For too long, in Canada and elsewhere, we have built housing that we think is in the best interests of a group of people who haven't had any influence on that choice. This country is largely driven by 2 factors that have cowed veterans. On the one hand, you've had doctors and nurses who have lorded it over the customer with the superiority of what they thought was their knowledge. And we have bullied a generation of people into believing that they are inferior. And then we've had the second trait, which is the not-for-profits who have targeted elderly people and said, "You are my mission." And we've had the presumption of arrogance that we actually know better than that what they know they want for themselves. And it's an enormous imposition, and it's given us an arrogance that will not translate to the next generation. What the next generation, what I want as I grow older, is I want a reason to live. I want you to understand what is in my heart, what are my hobbies, what are my interests. And what we're seeing worldwide is people like myself, we are organising communities for ourselves because the healthcare sector has failed to do this. And the best example of understanding why people choose to live the way they do is I invite you all to go and have a look at a beautiful housing development called Bentley Priory in London. And I'm going to give you a background to this development so you understand what's in the heart is what drives people to get out of bed every day. And the best form of wellness is to give people a reason to get up every day. Now, in Bentley Priory, it was a Grade 2 mansion that's been derelict for 30 years. It's on 25 acres of land in Richmond, in London, on the only slight rise in that city. And a public company called Barratt, got permission to develop the Priory partly into a museum and partly into apartments, and then do another 84 apartments in the broad surrounding gardens. And what Mark Clare, the CEO, didn't know when I went to his office to congratulate him on developing the best over 50s housing complex in the world last year, he said to me, "We're not in the business of over 50s housing." And he refused an award, point blank. And I said to him, "Every one of the persons registered to buy your apartments is over 70. He said, "We're not an over 50s housing provider." And I'll tell you why. And he didn't know. He got it accidentally right. What he didn't understand is his audience and constituency. That building was the headquarters in 1942 for Sir Keith Park, who was a New Zealander trapped in Britain before the war and asked by Churchill to formulate the defence of Britain in what that generation believes could have been the fall of civilization. So Sir Keith Park organised 40 RAF girls to man the maps inside Bentley Priory. And all around the south coast, throughout the southeast and south coast of England, he had 50,000 elderly people out in the fields every night. And they had to report on incoming planes over the channel their height, direction, number and type of aircraft. And Sir Keith Park, who had 2,500 pilots, including Canadian pilots, spread around 25 airfields, relied on that information from those elderly folk to ring in that information, and he had 2.5 minutes to make a decision and get his crew to scramble aircraft and get them in the air and above the enemy. And that Battle of Britain became known to all of us through the words of Churchill when he said that never has so much been owed by so many to so few. That story is understood and in the breasts of every English person over the age of 70. And when the opportunity came to actually live and share a part of history and to be an oral historian and to pass on to the next generation the torch of the story, its benefit to democracy, its celebration of freedom, that generation marched there knowing that they wanted to share the vision. Mark Clare is now looking for 10 other similar sites around the UK, knowing he's found the formula for what beats towards his door with a check in a depression with a decent margin on top, and that is give people a reason to live. The best operator in Australia last year was an ex-soldier who understood that the stresses for firemen, policemen, the army, ambulance officers, was to get them together on the small river in the Pilbara in Western Australia, living in dongas. Now, dongas are nothing much more than containers. It's not the housing, it's the fact that they can share experiences. They can deal with the aftermath of stress in an environment that they share and can talk to each other and spend 3, 4 and 5 months in total isolation in their own communities so that they can live vibrant lives again. We've got communities that are forming all over the world, driven by self-interest. I could take you down to Castlemaine in Victoria in Australia, and if I said that the common factors in that development was a paint shed, a proving ground, a skid pan, and an engine building unit, what sort of community would we be talking about? 250 men and the occasional wife live in a hot rod community. That's all they care for. They don't care a toss about their accommodation. When I visited, there wasn't a bed that had been made for a week, in my view. But all they care about is the activity. Now, if you want to go and see the most vibrant activity anywhere in the world, go down to the lee of the Rincon Mountains outside Tucson, and you'll find 240 apartments built in the desert with casitas. And they have been organised by an ex-academic. And he wanted to share his life with like-minded people in their latter years, where they had active debate. And in fact, a condition of my appearance there was that I had to participate in a debate on the negative. And the topic was that America was no longer a superpower. It ended in rancour. A pitcher of water was tipped over someone. But such is the passion that they lead their lives, that they are probably a slightly off-the-wall community, hard to manage, but they don't care. Their joy is getting a young lady to come out from the university, sit on a stool in the desert, and just play Puccini all night. Some of them listen to it from the adobe, some of them listen to it from the swimming pool, some just sit bare-legged in front of her in an adoring gaze. But the fact of the matter, these are febrile communities. They're not organised by do-gooders. They're organised by people who still have a passion for life. Education, which many women who are now aged 70 and 80 lost and didn't have when they were young, is a huge motivator when moulded in to the living environment. The best library I've seen is in Davis University retirement community. If you go to Ickatha in upstate New York, as women you are required to do 450 hours of dean-supervised study a year. You don't have to do exams. You've got Elder Hostel, which has grown to over 3 million adherents, with some of their people doing work in Africa a la the old Peace Corps. You've got others working on archaeological digs underneath Greek professors. Or you've got just people mentoring students in their local high school. If you want to create environments for people post 60, 70 and 80, you've got to start to consider what are the motivators. Don't give them a soulless home and expect them to come. I was challenged in the UK 2 years ago on this basis, that if I'm such a smart ass, what would I be suggesting is the best possible housing outcome for women? And in that case, I raised the prospect that in my observations worldwide, one of the greatest hobbies that most of us enjoyed was gardening. And if you wanted to motivate a 50, 60, 70 or 80-year-old person into doing something that was different, you would inveigle them into joining you in developing the finest garden to be built anywhere in the world in the last 100 years. The only two great gardens built in the last 100 years are at Anak in the UK and what the Singaporean government just recently completed in Singapore. But if you said to a group of people, come and join me. And we are going to live in an area in which we create the greatest garden built since the early gardens of the 19th century in Europe. You would get hundreds of people living in a barn for a year to be part of the mission. To give people a purpose in getting up every day, to leave their imprimatur upon death. You would turn it into one of the greatest tourism attractions that ever existed. Alnwick is only 42 acres and it engenders 500,000 visitors a year. Give people pride. Give them a reason for living. But we deny them that. One of the other observations I've got to make is we are losing about 5% of Canadians over the age of 60 every year to migration. People are seeking, in the second half of their lives, a different experience. And it happens to most couples between the ages of 45 and 60. It mainly starts in that magic moment when the last great bill has been paid for the youngest child. And suddenly a couple, after 10, 20, 30, 40 years of marriage or partnership, are suddenly free of all those obligations. And for the first time in possibly 30 years, they sit down to breakfast on a Saturday morning and they look across the table at each other, and the thought goes through his head, oh my God, this could be another 30 years with her. And she's thinking exactly the same. And the thought is that that magic moment, which I call the window, at that moment, you have got the capacity to get them to just about do anything. They'll either reaffirm the relationship or they'll decide that it's the end. And we're actually seeing divorce rates in that sector rising dramatically. But if they decide to reaffirm the relationship, the first decision they'll make is where are we going to stay and what are we going to do with the second half of our lives? Now, 85% of them choose to stay at home. They're either in blended families, they haven't retired, they've got a lot of treasured memories locked into that house. And for you to get them to move from that position requires an inspirational choice. The reality is that, and the only figures I've got to support this are from the National Association of Home Builders in the US, and they've suggested on their surveys that more money will be spent on renovating and modifying the home than will be spent on a new build. So therefore, if the boomer generation has made a decision to stay at home, we have to now start looking at solutions that suit us, not only in Sudbury but throughout Canada. Now, one of the methods I'm going to suggest to you as a public community is that I have a personal philosophy that everything has a beginning and an end, that nothing lasts forever. And so on that philosophy, you can argue that the long-term care communities and the nursing homes do have a shelf life. And that shelf life could be as little as 5 to 10 years. I'm going to suggest an idea that may significantly, if properly implemented, could make a huge difference to the way you manage ageing in the community. If you stop as an LTC operator looking inward, most LTC operators and nursing home operators consider that the boundaries of their properties is where their thinking stops, and their revenue comes from just inside the property. And I'm going to suggest to you that in a place like Sudbury, which is widespread geographically, and its population is not dense, why aren't we, for instance, looking at that LTC and saying, no, this is going to be a hub, a business hub, and it's going to capture 10 or 15 kilometres as a radius, and it's going to look after everyone inside that geographical radius. It's going to do little developments, 2 apartments, a duplex, triplex, 2 or 3 street frontage houses. It's going to build them and take the development profit. It's then going to lease them or sell them. It's then going to clear the snow, fix the building, supply the food, look after the person and manage the person inside it. The person inside of it may be a disabled young boy who's had a car accident. It may be someone who's 50, 60, 70 or 80. In theory, it may be a 30-year-old. And you deliver them a raft of services. You put pendants and phone systems into all of those houses, and you monitor them from that centre, from the business hub. So as the nursing home or LTC runs down and no longer has a complete full house of people, it is able to function and grow and congeal the community. And when other factors come into play, such as, and I'll explain the voucher system, we will be enabled to look after 99.9% of all people and all conditions inside the home. Some years ago, when I was back in Australia, I felt unwell, and my daughter was so concerned she took me to hospital. It took them 4 hours to determine that I had diabetes. And I was thrown out, literally told what I had and told to leave. And I was put in a hospital in the home program. And I was looked after in my own home by my own family. A doctor and a nurse arrived in their own cars twice a day for a week. And then they called once a week thereafter until they considered that I was on the mend. No one in the street knew I was ill. There were no definitions on the car. The doctor and the nurse wore mufti uniforms. I was intrigued, so I made inquiries and discovered that Epworth Hospital in Melbourne, Australia, has reduced its costs by 85%, and it has lifted the number of people it's treating in the home to representing 90% of its current constituency. And we have another factor at play in the world called the voucher system. And this will play an important part in Canada in coming years with generational change. The voucher system emanated in Germany, but is now in Great Britain, Australia and New Zealand. And elements of it are in the USA. Now the voucher system is predicated on the basis that we have all got bloated bureaucracies in the healthcare sector. And the only study that's been done was in the UK, which showed that from the moment $1 is created in Treasury and earmarked for the health care of the Sudburyan, 67% of the value of the dollar is lost as the ticket is clipped by various bureaucrats and overseers all the way down to the final recipient. And so what the voucher system is successfully doing in all of these countries, the voucher is created at source. There is an assessment of each person, a determination as to what the healthcare needs are, and the money is sent to that person directly, and that person makes the choice about who will care for him or her. Now, it's combined with an innovation that's come into New Zealand last year. And New Zealand's been ahead of every other developed country for 120 years on social matters. It gave women the vote first. And what it's done, it's changed employment law. It's essentially said that if you work for me and you come to me and say that you now want to care for a partner, a parent, or a child, or a neighbour, I can't fire you if it's your choice to say, I want to work 2 days a week, I want to work from home. You're only entitled to 40% of your salary, but I have to work with you to allow that to occur. That's employment law. Now, what it's done, when you combine the income from the voucher with a paid part salary, New Zealand has created the first paid carer workforce in the world. And what that's going to do is revolutionise the way that we handle healthcare in the future, in the sense it's going to make healthcare in the home an inevitability. We are seeing this now being advanced everywhere else in the developed world, and it won't be lost on Canadians who eventually learn about it and embrace it. The response was initially only as little as 5 years ago, when most developed countries thought that home help was essentially something that was going to be provided by an immigrant, by a Filipino or a Fijian. But the fact of the matter is, we are turning back to the 50s, when the neighbourhood became more important, and the beneficiary of a voucher is not necessarily going to be a child in the family. It could be a neighbour in the street. It could be a non-profit provider who's a default provider. But the fact of the matter is, it's a business opportunity. And if I'm looking for trends anywhere, I go to something like Beacon Hill, where I see a group of 80-year-old women who worry about the enemy in their life. And who's the enemy in every 80-year-old woman's life? The enemy is the oldest daughter. She's got a key to the house, and she's going to make a decision that's based on her best interests. And she's going to come to the view that it's in her best interest to have your best interests looked after by a third party. So the women of Beacon Hill were shrewd, and they had a little money, and they clubbed together and they created the first, in effect, co-op of elderly people who created it as a bailiwick against their own family members to stop being press ganged in the middle of the night. It's been so successful. Over 2,000 suburbs in the US now embrace this as a style of living. And what they do is they buy in all the goods and services that they need to stay in situ. The drivers, the handymen, the people running their errands, taking them for health checks. Every good and service, they make sure that they can look after themselves as a group, so that they can stay living in their houses and their own homes. At our generation, we are already getting home help. How many in this room are boomers aged between 45 and 60? A bit higher. Already, I'll take a bet that 90% of you are already getting home help, home care. And they all nod, no. How many of that same group in the last 6 months have paid a cheque to someone for ironing, cleaning, clearing the yard, doing any chores? Thank you. Now, we don't call it home care, but the fact of the matter is our generation is paying for a basket of services, concierge service, because our generation won't do any work that we believe someone else can do as well, because we put a premium on our time. We want to spend all our time on our things. So we've welcomed people into our homes for up to 20 years. Some of us have given keys to third parties who have access to our homes, and we've never done police checks. The fact of the matter is, we are an absolute lay-down misere for home care, but it'll never be badged that way. And if anyone here thinks that we are not significantly changing the way that healthcare is being delivered, they're deluding themselves. There won't even be hospitals in the future along the lines that you've got organised today. The purpose of a hospital will be just to distribute the money and to oversee the provision of goods and services by other providers, by specialists. The hospital's role will be to look after the most acute cases only, and all other services will be downstreamed to, in effect, meet budgets and raise standards. Even the future of dementia is not what we are preached to in the Canadian press. All of you would be forgiven for believing that dementia is a growth industry. Dementia is not a growth industry. And I'm going to give you the parallel message of HIV/AIDS. If you all go back 25 to 30 years and you look and remember those newspaper headlines that talked about pandemic, wiping out a generation of young men, what happened to that prediction? What happened to that prediction was it focused a whole raft of issues, including medicines, public health, public education, a better understanding of physiology, a better understanding of meditation and wellness and balance and life forces. All of those things has meant that yes, HIV is still with us, but HIV-infected persons still have a 90%, I call it lovingly, a shelf life. They're still in relationships, they can still hold down jobs, they can still contribute to the tax base. Dementia, Alzheimer's, cognitive impairment, Parkinson's will all be exactly the same. The same combination of medicines. There's already in existence in Australia an early detection test. There's already available in the UK medicines that, if applied now, halt the progress of the condition. It will parallel HIV almost identically. The pressure on big pharmacy companies to drive these outcomes is enormous. They have almost no drugs left in copyright, and there's no money in generics. The pressure from government, the pressure from various societies and us as a community will see that this will not be a straight line growth market that everyone has predicted in this country. And before I finish, I'd like to discuss what I call the sadness in this country of missed opportunities. And I do this deliberately to get you as a group to focus on the fact that we, as providers, are often blind to the realities of the marketplace that we see. And again, I leave you with this. It was an interloper, a man fresh to the industry, who introduced this solution to a market that we hadn't realised existed. And that is a builder came up to me 5 years ago in Las Vegas at a conference. And he said to me, did I agree with an article he had with him which suggested that 5% of all Americans were grandparents with the legal custody of their grandchildren. So we did some checking, and we had it verified by a number of church and charities in Nevada. So what he did, he just worked out as a matter of logic that surely any of us who've ever had to look after children on a full-time basis for the second time in our lives, as much as we love them and as much as it's a circumstance that we're drawn to, it is a chore. And on that basis, he went and bought a block of land next to a school. And upon that land, he built 2, 3 and 4 bedroom apartments. He built a playground, a paddling pool, a computer room and a rumpus room. And then we sent out the invitations to come and have a barbecue. And on 3 hours on a Sunday afternoon, he either sold or leased all the apartments. And it's the happiest community I've returned to ever. There was suddenly, he had lifted the lives of 70 and 80-year-old people who now could share the sad event that they had encountered, and they were able to get their lives back again because one man without baggage, one man without finding the reasons why he shouldn't do it, one man who didn't ask for a forum to discuss it, one man who used his instinct has delivered the finest outcome to over 70s in a subgroup in the Americas and is now on his 5th project. We have got dozens of submarkets that we are refusing to deal with. That really should be our mission. What are we doing in Canada, for instance, about ageing parents with disabled adult children who go to bed every night with angst in their breast as to what will happen to their child when they die? We've got opportunities banging on our door and we're not recognising them. When we consider in the months ahead what we're going to do in Sudbury, before we make any decision, consider what we've said here tonight. Every person over the age of 70 is an individual with a fine operating brain, the desire to live another day, an ability to contribute, and for almost all of them, they want to stay at home. And there's no reason why we can't create a community that allows that with the goods and services that I've suggested tonight take it on board, and we will not only lower the cost to the Canadian taxpayer, but develop finer and happier communities than we've currently got. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.